Okay, welcome everyone to another NOVEC talk. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Paulius. I am the Managing Director of the Center for Social Norms and Behavioral Dynamics at the University of Pennsylvania. And welcome to another NOVEC talk. We will follow the same agenda than in previous occasions. So there's a very short welcome that I always do. Then we will have our pre-recorded NOVEC Early Career Researcher presentation, this time by Clarissa Mang from the University of Munich. And then we will have our main speaker for today, Dr. Sarah Lowe's from the University of California, San Diego. And at the end, 15 minutes for questions and answers. A short reminder, as I always do, that the NOVEC Talks speaker series is organized by our Penn Center for Social Norms and Behavioral Dynamics with the generous support of the PPE program here at Penn and the partnership with the Master of Behavioral and Decision Sciences. Our Center for Social Norms and Behavioral Dynamics is a major research center at the university that works with all types of organizations in many parts of the world, doing consulting, research, and training to support positive behavioral change. You can find more information about us in our link. And if you scan this QR code, you can follow us on Twitter and follow all our news as well. As most of you probably already know, this is our spring programming for this year. We have one more speaker in 2 weeks that we will that we had announced before, Michael Muthukrishna from the London School of Economics. And we are very happy to announce today the list of our next speakers. Their names and profiles are already in our website. If you want more details, it will be on the same link at the same time every 2 weeks as before. If you are already registered, you don't need to register again, and you will get reminders on your email. For more information, you can visit the link on the screen or scan the QR code. A few ground rules. If this is the first time that you're joining, please mute yourself if you're not already muted while you're not speaking. If you can, please keep your camera on so that we have a more interactive experience. For questions, you can either use the chat during the talk or the raise hand function at the end. And the recordings of all our sessions are continuously uploaded in our website and also on Facebook Live. So with that, let me present our early career researcher for today. Clarissa Mang is a PhD candidate at the University of Munich in Germany, and the presentation is called Breaking the Silence, Group Discussions, Social Pressure, and the Adoption of Health Technologies. So let me share the video screen.
Thank you so much for this great opportunity to present this project entitled Breaking the Silence, Group Discussions, Social Pressure, and the Adoption of Health Technologies. This is joint work between Silvia Castro, a PhD student at the LMU Munich, and myself, Clarissa Mang, also a PhD student at the LMU Munich. We start this project from the observation that social pressure and stigma can deter individuals from adopting advanced health technologies and treatments. So for example, if we think about HIV treatments or mental health treatments, oftentimes people do not want to admit that they are suffering from these conditions because they are worried about being stigmatized. And so they do not adopt the latest available technologies to help them with diagnosing and treating these conditions. We want to explore the effect of social pressure and stigma on technology adoption, in particular in the setting of menstrual health management in Bangladesh, and test a potential solution for this constraint that social pressure and stigma pose for technology adoption. Why do we focus on menstrual health management? So first of all, menstruation is something that affects almost half the world's population at some point or other in their life. And we know from previous literature that inadequate menstrual health management can negatively affect health, education attainment, and labor market outcomes. So it's something that can have severe consequences for a large number of people. Moreover, with menstrual health management, we have a situation where the women that we want to interview are not worried or shy about admitting that they do menstruate, as would, for example, be the case with HIV or mental health issues, where participants are much less willing to participate in surveys about it. And so we can have a relatively large sample size without worrying too much about self-selected samples. And lastly, an interesting puzzle in the context of menstrual health management is that solutions such as sanitary pads are usually widely available and well known, and yet they are not widely adopted. So in this project, we want to ask the research question whether a simple light touch intervention of conducting open group discussions about menstruation can reduce the social pressure and stigma, and thus increase take-up of modern hygienic menstrual products, namely sanitary pads and reusable menstrual underwear. We look at this question by conducting a field experiment with 476 female workers in a Bangladeshi garment factory. And around half of those women are subject to our treatment, which consists of a 1-hour guided discussion session, where the women in groups of 15 to 20 people get to openly discuss menstruation and the experiences that they made with it. So we do not give them any extra information, or we do not educate them, but we just let them discuss among themselves and share their own experiences, anxieties, fears, and so on. Our primary outcomes are, first of all, the willingness to pay for sanitary pads, and second, the pickup rates of antibacterial reusable menstrual underwear, which we make available for them for pickup for free. Now, both of these products have to be picked up on the factory premises in a small convenience store there, run by a male shopkeeper. And so our hypothesis is that after the 1-hour discussion session among each other, these women will be bothered less by potentially being observed by colleagues when they pick up the product, and also will worry less about talking to a male shopkeeper, because they will feel that the stigma and the social norms around this topic are actually lower than they thought. And to look at the mechanism in more detail, we have also explicit measures for social norms, stigma, and taboos. And what we find is that indeed our treatment was successful in increasing the willingness to pay for sanitary pads by more than 25%. So it goes up from around 91 to around 114 taka. And we increased the pickup rates of the free menstrual underwear by more than 10 percentage points, from around 71 to around 81% of the women picking up this free product. Looking at the mechanisms, we can see that there was a shift in the perceived social norms. So while a majority of women before the treatment viewed purchasing pads from a male shopkeeper as socially inappropriate, this shifts to it being viewed as socially appropriate by the majority after treatment. And moreover, our explicit measures for stigma and taboo, where we gave the women a list of 4 statements expressing stigma and taboo and asked them to how many of those statements they agree, we can see that after the treatment, the women agreed to 50% fewer statements than before the treatment. And lastly, we conducted a discrete choice experiment in which we can pin down the mechanism and show that it is not a change in perceived value for money, but instead that the women really are bothered less by having to talk to a male shopkeeper and by potentially being observed by colleagues when they pick up the menstrual underwear. That was the short 5-minute pitch of our project. If you have any questions, comments, or recommendations, please feel free to email either myself or my co-author about this. And thank you so much again for this great opportunity.
Great. Thank you so much, Clarissa, for the great presentation. As in previous occasions, unfortunately, we don't have time for live questions for early career researchers, but I see Clarissa in the audience. So please feel free to write any questions or comments in the chat. So yeah, thank you so much again. And with that, I can introduce our main speaker for today, Dr. Sarah Lowe's from the University of California, San Diego. Is an assistant professor of economics at the University of California, San Diego. She has a PhD from the Political Economy and Government program at Harvard University, and was previously a postdoctoral fellow at Stanford University and an assistant professor of economics at Bokoko University. The presentation is called Traditional Supernatural Beliefs and Prosocial Behavior. And our moderator for today will be Dr. Alex Shpenev, a senior data research scientist here at the Center for Social Norms and Behavioral Dynamics. In this occasion, we won't have a co-author in the audience, but please feel free to write your questions in the chat. And Alex and I will be monitoring them. And then, yeah, at the end, we will have the Q&A slot. So thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Lowe's, and please feel free to proceed.
Okay, I think it's working. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
All right, perfect. You would think by this point I would be much better at Zoom, but you know, oh well. Okay, thank you so much for the opportunity to present here today. I'm really excited to hearing your questions and getting your feedback on this project. This is joint work with Etienne and Nathan, and we're interested in traditional supernatural beliefs and prosocial behavior. So sort of broadly, within economics, there's been a real dramatic increase in trying to understand the effects of religion and how religion matters for a wide variety of development outcomes. Even, and you know, not just within economics, of course, there's lots of work in, say, anthropology, understanding the role of particularly moralizing God religions. And so most of this work has focused on sort of what we call big God religions. So examples include Christianity and Islam. And sort of the observation is that while these are really important belief systems in the world, there's also a wide variety of other belief systems. So sort of more traditional spiritual or supernatural beliefs that are present both currently across many societies, but then also historically. And so what we'll be interested in is trying to understand the effects of one of these particular belief systems. Okay. So just as an aside, sort of this work on big God religions has suggested that sort of one of the benefits of these types of religions is that it's going to increase the scope and extent of prosocial behavior. And we're going to ask if there's a similar effect for these more traditional supernatural belief systems. So what do we have in mind when we talk about traditional supernatural belief systems? So in our context, it's going to be things like believing in the role of supernatural forces, believing in the importance and role of ancestral spirits. They'll often be individuals who have supernatural abilities. So these will be shaman or diviners or witch doctors. And these individuals can both provide supernatural protection and also aid in causing supernatural harm. There's also the belief that magical powers can be embodied in objects like amulets or fetishes, and these can both cause harm or grant protection. And sort of in contrast with the moralizing God religions, there's going to be less or no belief in the idea that these gods or spirits are moralizing agents. And there's also not going to be assignment to heaven or hell. So specific examples from the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is where we're working, include the idea that you can get spells and fetishes to make money or to harm others, the idea that you can undergo particular rituals to become bulletproof and therefore sort of fight with greater protection, the idea of this man called the Thunder Man who can sort of strike people down if they misbehave, the idea that it's important to honor your ancestors, for example. So specifically what we'll be studying is sort of what we'll call Bokoko, and these are sort of traditional beliefs that are going to encapsulate sort of believing in many supernatural related concepts. So this is going to include belief in witchcraft, belief in sorcery, belief in the importance of and role of connection with ancestors. Sort of maybe a bit too in the weeds is that there will be a distinction made in this context between witchcraft, which really has a very harmful connotation, and then sorcery, which is basically less of a negative connotation and more the idea that you might use sort of supernatural means for protection, while witchcraft is really about sort of supernatural mean to cause harm to others. And so also in this context, local leaders, particularly sort of say like village elders or village chiefs, are often believed to be endowed with some of these supernatural powers. And they use this Bokoko as a means of protecting their community. So we'll be focusing on the Democratic Republic of Congo, but just sort of as an overview, prevalence of belief in witchcraft is really widespread in sub-Saharan Africa. So you can see that sort of in Congo, for example, which is the center here, 70 to 80% of people report believing in witchcraft, but sort of in many places, there's sort of high prevalence of belief in witchcraft. And while the focus of today's talk is on sub-Saharan Africa, just worth noting that sort of belief in witchcraft isn't unique to sub-Saharan Africa presently, nor is that the case historically. So sort of across many countries, people report believing in witchcraft. Okay, so traditional religious beliefs are sort of very prevalent throughout history. And sort of interestingly, these beliefs tend to persist even with the introduction of these more organized religions such as Christianity and Islam. And even we sort of observe that some of these, Christianity and Islam can absorb some of these features of these traditional religions. So the use of superstitions or rituals, for example. And so specifically what we're going to ask then in this project is, what are the consequences of these types of traditional supernatural beliefs for prosocial behavior? And sort of a priori, there's a couple of different things that could happen. So first, it could have a positive effect. So it could basically provide a supernatural threat that promotes social cohesion and harmony. It could have no effect, in which case I guess we wouldn't have so much of a paper to write, or it could have a negative effect. So it could adversely affect social cohesion. So why might it have a positive effect? So if we think about sort of the work on moralizing God religions that finds these benefits for, say, Christianity or Islam, increasing cooperation, and part of the sort of mechanism there is that you have this moralizing God who's watching you, who can punish you if you behave badly. We might think that sort of these types of traditional supernatural beliefs have a similar sort of effect. So they induce cooperative behavior because of the threat or the worry that others will use magic against you if you behave badly. So the idea that people are constantly reminded not to offend others because it might turn out that they are witches or will use witchcraft against you. And so in this world, then the presence of these types of beliefs will cause individuals to act in a more prosocial manner. And now the mechanism isn't that you have this God who's going to assign you to heaven or hell, but rather that, there's a witch or someone who's willing to punish you if you misbehave. If we look at data from Gallup, for example, on reasons that people report visiting a witch doctor, you can find that a lot of these are actually associated with this type of mechanism. So people report that they visit a witch doctor to place a spell on someone, or to cure a spell that's been placed on them, or to inflict pain on someone. So the other hypothesis is really this idea that it actually has negative effects on social cohesion. And there's some reason to believe that this is the case based on sort of already existing evidence. So there's work from Boris Gershman, for example, who looks at the relationship between belief in witchcraft in sub-Saharan Africa and levels of generalized trust. And he finds a strong and negative relationship between belief in witchcraft and trust. So places that have stronger beliefs in witchcraft are also much less trusting of others. And then sort of the challenge here is, how do we interpret sort of the correlational evidence that he provides? So in particular, we want to understand, is this relationship between witchcraft and lower levels of trust causal? He also has this other really great paper that shows that exposure to the slave trade, for example, changes levels of belief in witchcraft. And then there's other work showing that the slave trade also affects levels of trust. And so we might be worried that there's some omitted variables that are driving this relationship. And so in this world, then sort of the presence of belief in witchcraft or other supernatural beliefs may actually induce less prosocial behavior. Okay, so we're going to try to contribute to a couple of different literatures here. The first is this work showing or discussing the origins of belief in witchcraft and the effects of belief in witchcraft. As I was mentioning, Gershman's work suggesting that witchcraft is a legacy of the slave trade, and also his work on the effects of belief in witchcraft on mistrust. And then sort of a more anthropological literature on the role of witchcraft beliefs. So this really great work by Jean-Philippe Plateau suggesting that belief in witchcraft is a means of reinforcing distribution. Some really interesting work by my co-author and others suggesting that maybe people use witchcraft as a means of managing stress. And then some work I have with other co-authors trying to understand the role that sort of local leaders play in propagating these beliefs. So sort of in an ideal world, if we're interested in the causal effect of belief of these traditional supernatural beliefs on prosocial behavior, we would be able to randomly sort of vary who has these set of beliefs. And then, as anyone who studies any sort of cultural belief system knows, that's just not possible. And anyways, I feel like only economists would say such a thing, like ideally we could randomly vary culture. But in any case, we can't do that. So we're going to try to do what we think is the next best thing. And so what we'll do then is basically in a series of lab experiments, we're going to randomly vary the extent to which the person you're paired with has a belief, a strong traditional supernatural belief. And so in effect, we can think of that as varying sort of the threat or exposure to belief in witchcraft. So individuals in our study are going to complete a series of experiments and surveys. And these are designed to measure prosocial behavior towards this other player that you're paired with. And the games are anonymous in that you don't know the exact identity of who you're paired with, but we provide some information about the other player. And so one of the pieces, well, I'll tell you in detail what characteristics we're providing information on. But one of those pieces of information is going to be the extent to which that other player has a strong belief in Bokoko, which is sort of the term that encapsulates all of these traditional beliefs. And then you're randomly assigned a player with a random set of characteristics. So the profile of the other player is sort of randomly assigned. And then that allows us to answer the question of how does being paired with someone who has stronger traditional supernatural beliefs affect the way you treat them? And we'll have a couple of different experiments that I'll describe in more detail shortly. The first is a dictator game. So you're given an endowment and you choose how much to allocate to another player. The second is a choose-your-dictator game, in which you're basically a player 2 in a dictator game, but get to choose one of 2 players to be your player 1 in that dictator game. And then we have a joy of destruction game. And in short, you're basically, you and another player are given an endowment, and what you as the decision maker get to do is decide, do you want to pay some of your own endowment to either increase or decrease the endowment of the other player, or you can choose to do nothing, in which case everyone goes home with the amount that they've been given by the researchers. The second thing we're going to do, and so we can think of that as sort of measuring how people behave towards those who have strong traditional beliefs. The second thing we're going to do is try to measure norms. So we'll use this strategy developed by Krupka and Weber, which is an incentivized measure of sort of what most people think is the right thing to do in this situation. And then finally, we're going to measure how are those who have strong traditional beliefs perceived. And we'll use some conjunction fallacy questions to try to measure that. Okay. So let me describe briefly the samples that we're working with. So this project has taken place, before COVID, but then on pause because of COVID, and then getting restarted again. So there's a little bit of time that has elapsed. So our first sample is from an urban area in northern Congo, from whom we collected data in 2018 and 2019. We collected data from 520 randomly selected individuals in this urban area. And then due to sort of like our need to be able to match people, people were eligible to participate if they were from the 3 largest ethnic groups in the region, which is going to represent like 90% of a random sample, and if they had a strong or very strong belief in Christian God. And the reason we have that second sort of requirement is that when you survey people about their own belief in the Christian God, basically everyone, like 95% of the sample, has a strong or very strong belief in the Christian God. And so we just didn't think it would make sense to have people who didn't. And the second thing we do is then in 2021, we also extend the sort of same data collection, but now in 50 randomly selected villages in the region. And so we'll collect data from 600 individuals, so 12 from each of these villages. And the data collection process will be identical, except we won't have any of this screening based on ethnicity or belief in Christian God. So here's just a map of the region. So the territory we're working in, and then the villages that were ultimately sampled as part of our 2021 sample. Okay. So here are some summary statistics from our city sample. I guess a couple of things to note are, first, that people have very strong traditional beliefs. So they have strong or very strong beliefs in Bokoko on average. And then, let's see. The same is true for our village sample. So again, people have very strong traditional beliefs. They also have very strong belief in the Christian God. Okay. So if we pool our samples, we can sort of provide a little bit of information trying to understand how strongly held are people's sort of belief in supernatural powers, such as witchcraft. And you can see that sort of 46% of the sample report a very strong belief, and then an additional 26% of the sample report a strong belief. So sort of it's clear that these belief systems are really prevalent. If you ask people the extent to which they've been harmed by witchcraft or other supernatural means, about 60% of the sample report that they themselves have been directly harmed. And then about 40% worry about harm through supernatural means. So like the idea here is that this is really salient for the way people understand their own world and like their own misfortunes. And then you can also ask people sort of the extent to which they think witchcraft is an effective means for harming others. So this is a scale increasing in the extent to which it's effective. And so most people think it's, effective or very effective at harming others. Okay. So just briefly, some correlates of strength of belief in witchcraft. So the more educated you are, the less likely you are to believe in witchcraft. Interestingly, those who report having a strong belief in the Christian God are also likely to report a strong belief in witchcraft. This is the case both across our city sample and our villages sample. So again, like education, less correlated with, or least lower belief in witchcraft, and belief in Christian God, a stronger belief in witchcraft. And sort of usually when I present, people are surprised by this positive correlation between belief in Christianity and belief in witchcraft. But sort of understanding the context a little bit better, I think helps shed light on why that might be the case. So for example, if we use data from Gallup, if you ask people if you can use prayer to protect one from witch doctors, 84% of the samples say that yes, that's an effective means of protection. So sort of these belief systems coexist in most people's minds. And then at least in the region where I work, these new churches that have been sort of taking off in the last decade or so tend to integrate these traditional beliefs into their teachings. So they accept that sort of threat from supernatural means is real. And then they conveniently also offer the tools to protect yourself from those supernatural threats. So let me describe in a bit more detail the experiment that we do. So experiments take place in participants' home. We want to ensure privacy in their decision-making. So this is an example of a setup where we have our enumerator on the left And someone who is making this sort of experimental choices has this umbrella in which he can shield his allocations because they're given real money to make their choices. And they make their allocation choices. They put their money in these envelopes that are then put into this bag. So the enumerator can never see how much people choose to allocate, and he can't really tell based on sort of the envelopes themselves what people have done. So what happens in our experiments is that people are given information about the person that they're paired with in the experiment. And they're given 7 pieces of information on the other player. So they're given information on the age group of the other player, the sex of the other player, the education level of the other player, so whether or not they completed primary, completed secondary, whether or not they're from the same ethnic group or a different ethnic group, the strength of the other player's belief in the Christian God, so whether or not they have a strong or very strong belief when we're in the urban setting, and then, you know, a very weak to very strong belief in the village setting. Their strength of traditional beliefs, so weak, intermediate, strong, or very strong. And then finally, whether or not they grew up in the city or grew up in an urban, or sorry, rural area. So this is sort of the set of information they'll hear about the other player before they're making their choice. So the way we communicate this information to the other players is in the following way. So you will play with someone randomly chosen from the population of either the city or the rural areas. We can't tell you exactly who they are, but we'll tell you some information about them. So for example, the other player is an old woman that has completed primary, that's from your ethnic group, that has a strong belief in the Christian God and a weak belief in Bokoko, for example. So this is sort of how they might hear information on the other player. So let me describe to you how we're estimating the effects of sort of exposure of being paired with someone with traditional beliefs on prosocial behavior. So we'll have our outcome of interest for player I, who's been paired with player J. So this will be your choice in the dictator game, choose joy of destruction game, for example. And then we will have measures of player I, so the respondent's traditional beliefs, so the extent to which they believe in witchcraft. We'll have a measure of player J's traditional beliefs, so the extent to which the person they've been paired with believes in witchcraft. And then we'll have fixed effects for all of those different characteristics that I just listed to you. So like the other player's age group, gender, etc. Likewise, we will also include player I fixed effects for those all the same analogous characteristics. And then our coefficient of interest then is the effect of beta 2. So the effect that sort of the other player's traditional beliefs has on our respondents' behavior in these games. So because people complete the experiments more than once, we're able to also have an additional estimating equation in which we have a player I fixed effect. And then in this estimating equation, we have a fixed effect for the respondent, and then we have the fixed effects for all the other player 2 characteristics. And then here the coefficient of interest is this beta, the effect of the other player's traditional beliefs. So we'll present the results in a couple of different ways. So we'll measure traditional beliefs either as a 1 to 4 variable, increasing in strength of belief in witchcraft. We'll present them where we just do indicator variables for each category, where the omitted category is weak or very weak beliefs. And then finally, a version where we combine 3 and 4, so strong and very strong belief in witchcraft or Bokoko. So our first experiment then is the dictator game. So in the dictator game, individuals are given an endowment, in this case, 1,000 Congolese francs. And so they're given 10 100 CF bills, and they're asked to allocate money between an envelope for themselves, so this Ngai envelope, and then an envelope for another player, which is the Mobeti Lisano 2. And they'll play this game twice. So one time they'll be randomly paired with someone with a strong belief in supernatural belief, and another time they'll be paired with someone with a weak belief, supernatural belief. And then, you know, you'll remember they're making these choices with real money, but they have the privacy to sort of shield their allocation choices into these envelopes. And so what we find is I'll present results. Basically, the tables are all going to look the same. So I'll do first city and then village results. And the tables are set up in the following way. So the first two columns present the results using that integer measure of strength of belief. The next two columns do the dummy variables for each of the categories of strength of belief. And then finally, columns 5 and 6, they're combining the strong or very strong indicator variable. And then the odd number columns are that first specification I told you, where we have fixed effects for all the player 1 and 2 characteristics. And then the even number columns is the specification where we have the player 1 fixed effects. So we're asking within a player, when you get paired with someone with a strong relative to weak, how do you behave? And so I think for interpretation, it's easiest to focus on columns 5 and 6. So when you're paired with someone who has a strong or very strong traditional belief, you are less generous with them in a dictator game. So you're allocating fewer Congolese francs towards them. And just also we have, so this would be sort of inconsistent with the story that sort of these supernatural beliefs are increasing cohesion or increasing prosocial behavior. We find analogous results in our village sample, though they're less precise. So if we look again at column 5 and 6, you find that there's a negative coefficient, though it's not significant. Okay. The next experiment we do is this Choose-your-dictator game. So here you have our participants, they're shown 2 player profiles, a person A and a person B, and they choose a person A or a person B to be their dictator in a dictator game. And so they'll hear the 2 profiles of the person A and the person B, and then they'll choose which one they want. And then they'll play twice. And each time when they're presented with these profiles, one of those people will have a strong belief and one of those people will have a weak belief. And so here are the results from the city sample. So we find really large effects in the Choose Your Dictator game. So when you're paired with someone with a strong or very strong belief, traditional belief, supernatural belief, you find you're 36 percentage points less likely to choose them as your dictator. So really substantial effect sizes. We find a similar effect for our village sample. Now it's 34 percentage points less likely to choose this other person between the person A and person B if that person has a strong or very strong traditional belief. And then the third experiment is this Joy of Destruction game. Here, our participant is the player 1 and they're paired with a player 2. Both of them are given 2,000 Congolese francs. And then our participant has to make a choice. The participant can choose from one of 3 options. The first is they can pay 200 from their own endowment to decrease player 2's endowment by 1,000. So this is why it's called a Joy of Destruction game, is that basically people are willing to spend money to destroy some of the endowment of the other player. The second option they have is to do nothing, in which case both players go home with the 2,000 Congolese francs. And then the third option they have is to pay 200 from their own endowment to increase the other player's payoff. And again, the game is played twice. And one time they'll be paired with someone with a strong belief, and another time they'll be paired with someone with a weak belief. So what we find sort of is that most people choose to do nothing. So 50% of the observations don't choose to increase or decrease, and everyone goes home with the 2,000. About 16% choose to decrease the other player's payoff in the city setting, 20% in the village setting. So there's a substantial portion of people who are willing to pay to destroy the other person's endowment. And then finally, about 30% of the sample, both in the village and the city, choose to increase the other player's payoff. And sort of what we find in this Joy of Destruction game then is that in both our city and our villages sample, people behave less prosocially in the Joy of Destruction game towards the other player when that other player has a strong traditional belief. So they're less likely to increase the other player's endowment and more likely to decrease the other player's endowment. So these are the results from the city and then analogous results from the village. So in summary, we find consistent evidence that when you're paired with someone with a strong traditional belief, you behave less prosocially towards them. I won't be presenting these other results today, but we don't find that any of the other characteristics that we gave information on, so there's 6 other pieces of information, like their level of education, their age group, whatever, that these have consistent effects in terms of how people behave. We also find, and I think this is pretty interesting, that player 1's own beliefs aren't systematically related to prosocial behavior. So those who have these strong traditional beliefs aren't behaving any differently. Though of course, you know, these are endogenous. And then finally, we don't find any consistent evidence of an interaction effect between player 1's traditional beliefs and player 2's traditional beliefs. Though some limited evidence in the Joy of Destruction that if player 1 has a strong traditional belief and is paired with a player 2 with a strong traditional belief, it sort of mitigates that negative effect of behaving negatively towards them. Okay, so in the first set of games, we find this strong evidence that people behave actually less prosocially towards those with traditional beliefs. The next thing we were interested in doing is trying to measure the norms. So what do most people believe is the right thing to do in a situation when you're paired with someone who has these strong or weak traditional beliefs? And we're going to use this methodology from Krupka and Weber, which are intended to measure sort of what most people agree is the appropriate action to do in a different situation. And what's sort of nice about this is it's going to be also less susceptible to demand effects. You might be worried that sort of our behavioral game results are driven by sort of experimenter demand effects. So people think, these foreigners are here, like they're probably, you know, Christian missionaries, and they probably think witchcraft is bad, so we're going to behave this way in the experiments because of that. And so for these Krupka and Weber questions, we're basically not asking people about their own beliefs, but we're incentivizing them to say what most people are going to say is the correct thing to do. Okay, and so we'll ask people how socially appropriate different actions are in each of those 3 experiments that we did. And we'll do this with both our city and our village samples. And sort of as with the experimental games, we're going to randomly vary the characteristics of the other player. And again, they'll sort of say how appropriate actions are for each game twice, one time when the other player has a strong traditional belief and one time with a weak traditional belief. So let me just tell you precisely what the language is. So they'll describe, the numerator will describe the sort of game again, which they should remember because they participated in it. And then you'll ask them to evaluate how appropriate any particular decision you can make in that game is, and if it's socially appropriate and consistent with moral behavior or inappropriate. And then we'll define socially appropriate with that for them. So whether or not, you know, most people will agree this is the ethical thing to do. And then the choices that they have are from very socially inappropriate to very socially appropriate. And so importantly, again, we're not asking them what they think is the right thing to do, but what they think most people are going to say is the right thing to do. And if they give the most common answer, then we sort of will pay them what we think is a pretty large amount for the setting. So if they are able to guess what most people say is the right thing to do for a game, they'll get 5,000 francs. And then they'll do this for 3 different games. So actually, you know, the potential amount of money they can make is pretty substantial for this setting. So in the dictator game, just to remind you, there's going to be 11 possible allocations that can be made because you can allocate 0 to 1,000 Congolese francs to the other player. For the Choose Your Dictator game, there's 2 possible choices, person A or person B. And then the Joy of Destruction game, there's 3 possible choices. So to reduce the payout, to do nothing, or to increase. And then our estimating equations are going to be entirely analogous to what we did for the game's outcomes. So I think we can just move on. Yeah, so it's the same setup. So here are the results for the dictator game norms measurement for the city. So what I present on the left side is the specification with all the player 1 and player 2 characteristic fixed effects. On the right panel is the specification with the player 1 fixed effects. You can see that the results are basically analogous. And so what we find is that the outcome here is how appropriate any particular action is. So the way to interpret this is that the other player's strength of traditional beliefs has no effect on how appropriate it is to allocate 0 francs. And that's because in general, people think it's inappropriate to allocate nothing to the other player. But you can see that sort of if the other player has a strong traditional belief, people find it more appropriate to allocate these low amounts, so 100 to 400 francs. And then they find it less appropriate to allocate any of these larger amounts. So an equal division or higher becomes less appropriate when the other player has a strong traditional belief. So these are for the city sample, and we find the exact same pattern for the village sample. The next experiment was obviously that Choose-your-dictator game. And we're going to find again that sort of consistent with what we observed in the games, the norms measurement suggests that it's also less appropriate to choose another player when that other player has a strong traditional belief. We find that for both the city sample and the villages sample. So sort of entirely consistent with the game behavior. And then finally, for the joy of destruction, we find that it's more appropriate to decrease the other player's endowment if they have a strong traditional belief. There's no effect on doing nothing. And then it's less appropriate to increase that other player's endowment. So far, these results are really consistent with the behavior that we observed in the experiments. Oh, and here's the villages results, which is the same as the city results. So far, we've observed behavior in these experiments where people are less prosocial. Not only are they less prosocial, it's agreed upon that that's actually the right thing to do when you interact with someone with these strong traditional beliefs. And I guess it's sort of puzzling, just given that I told you 80% of people themselves are reporting that they hold these beliefs. So the last thing that we try to do is understand how are those who hold these beliefs viewed. So one strategy would just be to directly ask people, how do you view those who have strong traditional beliefs? But we sort of didn't want to be too obvious or have any issues with experimenter demand effects. And so we chose this alternative strategy of these conjunction fallacy questions. So the conjunction fallacy was this term coined by Tversky and Kahneman, where people tend to rate the conjunction of two events as more probable than any one of the single events. And their canonical example of this is Linda, the outspoken and very bright philosophy college student who is deeply concerned with discrimination and other social issues. And it turns out when people hear about Linda, they're likely to say, it's more likely that she's a bank teller and is active in the feminist movement than say just being a bank teller. And so we're going to take this style of question and of course adapt it to our setting because Linda, the philosophy student, won't be very salient to our respondents. And we'll basically try to use this method to ask if unfavorable traits are seen as more representative of those who have strong traditional beliefs. And this has been used in other settings, say trying to understand perceptions towards race or sexuality. Okay, so we're going to do this in the city that we work in, and we'll ask people a series of conjunction fallacy questions, and they'll try to basically look at different types of traits. So positive traits such as honesty or negative traits such as dishonesty. We'll have a baseline characteristic. So analogous to the bank teller one, it'll be like whether or not you're a cook or whether or not you're married or whether or not you're a bricklayer. And then they'll be given the option of this baseline characteristic or the baseline characteristic plus a strong believer in Bokoko, or the baseline characteristic plus a strong believer in the Christian God. This allows us to ask one, when are people making conjunction fallacies? Are you more likely to make a conjunction fallacy when it's a negative characteristic versus a positive characteristic? And do people systematically vary in how they view are they more likely to make negative associations for these traditional beliefs versus negative associations for Christian beliefs? So here's some example of the types of conjunction fallacy questions we have. So for example, whether or not someone is well-liked or perceived well by other members of the society. So we have Mary, she's 30 years old. Others always really like her. They're really happy to spend time with her. So which of these is most probable? She's a farmer, which by the way, most people are farmers. She's a farmer who's a strong believer in traditional beliefs, or a farmer with a strong belief in the Christian God. And then we'll have an analogous story about whether or not, we have someone who's disliked. So we have Ruth, and everyone in her neighborhood is friendly, except they don't want to invite Ruth to their bride price ceremony, even though they're inviting everyone else. So how likely is it that she's a cook, or a cook who has strong traditional beliefs, or a cook who's a strong believer in the Christian God? And we'll have other sort of characteristics such as jealousy or not jealous, for example. So here's sort of, I think, a really nice way to summarize our results, because it comes through really clearly. So the first thing is that we have sort of a falsification type question. So we have a question that has nothing to do with any sort of moral connotation. So it's not honest or dishonest, it's not well-liked or vindictive or whatever. It's just a story about Fiston who really likes to eat, and his favorite food is chicken and rice. And then we ask, how likely is it that Fiston is, a bricklayer? How likely is it Fiston is a strong believer in the Christian God and a bricklayer, or a strong believer in Bokoko and a bricklayer, for example? And there we find when there's sort of the story has no moral connotation, when it's just about like this guy who likes to eat, people aren't making the conjunction fallacy very often. So most people just choose the baseline characteristic of he is a bricklayer. And then a few people make the conjunction fallacy. But then once we turn to these characteristics, like the positive ones, like honest, not jealous, not vindictive, well-liked, and the negative characteristics, dishonest, jealous, whatever, we find that people are making these conjunction fallacies at a really high rate, and that it systematically varies based on whether or not it's positive and negative, for whether or not they're making the conjunction fallacy for a believer in witchcraft, for example. So when it's the positive characteristics, such as honest and generous, you find that between 80 and 90% of the sample are making this conjunction fallacy and saying that they're the baseline characteristic plus a strong believer in God. When it's the negative characteristic, you get the opposite pattern. People are making the conjunction fallacy, and they're more likely to be a strong believer in witchcraft, for example. So 90% make the conjunction fallacy and say they're vindictive, they're jealous, they're dishonest. We had also included a scenario about being wealthy and poor, and we had thought that perhaps, there's some sense in which people think, Christians, so there's this prosperity sort of gospel type philosophy where people think that if you're really Christian, you might become rich, but also you might become rich because you use witchcraft. So we weren't quite sure which way it would go, but it doesn't sort of seem to be systematically linked in the same way these positive and negative characteristics are. So in summary, sort of what we're finding is that when you're paired with someone with these strong traditional beliefs, it's inducing less prosocial behavior. And when we did our norms measurement, this behavior is also entirely consistent with what people expect you to do and want you to do. And then sort of third, people systematically view those who have strong traditional beliefs in a more negative light. And so this is going to reject the hypothesis that these traditional religions promote prosocial behavior in the same way sort of some evidence has suggested that, say, Christianity or Islam do. And it's going to support the hypothesis consistent with these papers from Gershman that there is this negative effect of these beliefs on prosocial behavior. And then that sort of raises the question of like, okay, well, why do these beliefs persist if there are these really significant negative effects of them on prosocial behavior? So like as an individual who has these strong beliefs, people are justified in treating me worse. I view those people as worse as well. So why do we see the persistence here? And so we think that there's probably two classes of explanations for why these beliefs persist. So the first is that this is an example of cultural mismatch. So that sort of the original function of these belief systems has changed over time as the environment has changed, for example. And what we're really interested in here is the introduction of Christianity. So it could be that, witchcraft didn't have these negative effects, but with the introduction of Christian missionaries who made a lot of effort, for example, to malign these belief systems, that may have changed the way that sort of these beliefs operate. And so that's one possibility. And then the other possibility is that, we focused on one set of outcomes, which is prosocial behavior. But there may be other benefits of belief in witchcraft or these traditional supernatural beliefs that we're not measuring. And that may explain why they continue to persist despite these negative effects that we've observed. And so I guess, one thing I want to note when we're trying to puzzle through like why we have these negative effects and yet these persistent belief systems is that these supernatural beliefs that we have in mind is this bundle that's hard to decompose in the sense that as a person who lives in this setting, I can't choose to believe in witchcraft only, but not have the same belief that my ancestors are really important for my life. So you can't sort of discard elements of the bundle without discarding the whole bundle. And we could imagine that this is really personally costly for sort of your own individual identity if you have to discard this whole sort of bundle of things. And this is, particularly the case because, for example, the role of ancestors is going to be really important for land ownership, really important for politics, even if parts of this belief system are stigmatized. So sort of in terms of how people are perceived or how these two belief systems are perceived, Bokoko is viewed negatively. So if we think of this sort of traditional supernatural belief system as a bundle, Bokoko is viewed negatively, but witchcraft is really viewed as much worse. But it just may be hard to discard the whole bundle as an individual, given that it's costly. So we also talk to people about sort of why they think people believe in witchcraft and practice witchcraft. So for example, if we ask people about belief in witchcraft, they have the view that sort of witchcraft kills and eats people, that it exists, but it's not good to use it. And Bokoko is a little bit more sort of ambiguous, like Bokoko protects the village, it's our custom, we can't reject it. I'm not so sure about it, it's close to witchcraft. So these things are linked in people's minds. And so it just may be hard to discard the bundle, and that may help explain sort of some of this persistence. And then there may also be sort of effects in other realms, which this paper, it's a little bit outside of the scope to do, but Nathan in another paper has some evidence that it may help with stress management. And then in another project that we're currently working on, we sort of are interested in some political benefits of these beliefs, particularly when local leaders are able to assert that they have particularly strong sort of supernatural abilities, and these abilities may have the benefit of protecting sort of the village from supernatural threat. Okay. So am I out of time? I'm sorry, what time do I end?
Yes, you're just on time.
Okay,
now.
then perfect. I'll just wrap up then. So, I guess what I hope people take away from this is that these types of traditional supernatural beliefs are really deeply held by people. They're really important for understanding sort of misfortune in their own lives. That people continue to hold these beliefs despite sort of the deep penetration of Christianity into this area, and despite what we've documented in terms of how they can be individually costly. And so sort of what we're trying to work on now is this, from a longer term evolutionary perspective, trying to understand why these beliefs persist. And sort of our next step in our project will be taking advantage of variation and exposure to Christianity in our region of interest and trying to see if that explains some of the differences in what we observe. But in short, I guess there's lots of really, I think, important and interesting open questions on the causes and consequences of these types of belief systems. And I think that they're really important to study, given that they're really central to people's lives and their own worldviews and are linked to political and economic outcomes. So thank you so much for your attention and for the opportunity to share this.
Thank you very much. This was really interesting. There were quite a few questions in the chat. I'll start with my question and link it to one of the questions that was asked. So we, in our center, one of our colleagues actually had a situation in South Sudan where they had to be evacuated because they were blamed for the dry season. And that was related to the witchcraft beliefs. And to the fact that the person who was there was white. So I'm curious how you kind of, like, what steps do you take to make sure that there's no effect of the researcher on your study? Because I assume when they see a person from the United States, that might have an effect on the honesty in their responses. And linking to that, there was a question in the chat about So when you were talking about the choice of name in one of your studies, did you take into account the kind of like the connotations that come with that name, whether that name sounds traditional, Christian, or Muslim, or anything else? So in general, how do you like navigate the cultural and social context in the country to make sure that they don't feel that they're like threatened by the outsiders? Thank you.
Yeah, no, this is a very important question. So thanks for the opportunity to discuss this. So I guess the first thing that maybe I should have made more clear is that our participants are never interacting with the foreigners. So we exist, but we're never sort of the ones directly interviewing people. So we have a team of locally recruited Congolese enumerators who are doing all of the enumeration. But precisely because of these experimenter demand effects is the reason why we made a couple of design choices. So the first is that when we tell people about the other player, it's not like we're like, they have a strong and weak belief in witchcraft. Those aren't the two, like we tell them 7 pieces of information. And quite frankly, if you told me ahead of time that someone would remember 7 pieces of information and be able to make choices in a systematic way, I would have been like, well, I would have forgotten immediately. So we were hoping to shroud our interest and also be able to control for like a wide variety of characteristics that may vary with belief in witchcraft. And so we think that sort of helps with that demand effect. And then likewise, we think that sort of our norms measurement strategy also has that same benefit in that, you know, we aren't asking them what they think is right or what other like foreigners will think is right, but what they think most other people around them will think is right. And then the second question was about the names and the conjunction fallacy questions, I believe.
Yes.
So we basically, you know, in our own database of random participants in the city, know what common names are. And so we just randomly select some. And then since you have positive and negative framing, we're going to vary we sort of randomly vary whether or not a man or a woman's name is presented, whether or not it's a more traditional name or a more French name. But we just basically chose common names. I didn't present the results here, but you can do some sort of, you can also run regressions with that data, and it's not going to matter really sort of the characteristics that we present aside from, yeah, the positive or negative connotation, if that makes sense. So we try to deal with that by, yeah, varying randomly sort of the name and the gender of the name and traditional and French.
And to follow up on that, how homogeneous or heterogeneous are the societies that you survey? Like,
on what dimension? Yeah, sorry, on what dimension?
So let's say religion, for example, whenever I think of sub-Saharan Africa, for some reason in my head, immediately Nigeria and just the Christian-Muslim divide. So I guess religion would be a larger part of it, but maybe some other cultural aspects.
Yeah, no, that's a super good question. So I should have gone over that in the summary stats. So the city we work in is going to be predominantly one ethnic group with 2 other groups that are also pretty well represented, and then a lot of very small sort of groups represented. So it'll be sort of a little bit diverse, but like lots of different groups represented, but 1 majority group and 2 sort of other fairly large groups. In the villages surrounding the urban area we work in, it's going to be mostly that predominant ethnic group from the city with small pockets of other groups. So ethnically, that's the sort of situation. Religiously, most people, like the vast majority of the sample is going to be Christian with like lots of different denominations of Christianity represented. So Protestants, Catholics, and then all of these sort of new emerging churches. So Pentecostal, born again, evangelical. And what's also super interesting is looking at how that composition has changed over time. So, you know, yeah, the Catholics and the Protestants had dominated the market, but now we're facing all of this competition from these other religions. So.
Thank you very much. And we'll alternate between the chat and questions that people can ask themselves. So Aiden has a question. I see that you raised your hand.
Thank you very much. That was a fabulous pronunciation of my name that I haven't heard in a long, long time. Everybody calls me Aiden. All right. Thank you, sir. It's a great paper. It's a kind of like superstitious behavior is a passion project of mine personally. First, a quick question about kind of like how fine-grained you elicited the belief about kind of like gods, because all this research are talking about people even having a different view of how God kind of like, let's say, intervene, in a sense that some people see gods as being punishers. Some people see them as being benevolent actors and so on and so forth. So this kind of like sub-beliefs, let's say, I think it's gonna change the behavior quite significantly. I have one comment about the name of the paper, and you call it technically, the paper is about prosocial behavior, while the game is mainly dictator game. At least in the experimental circle, dictator game is mainly for measuring fairness. All right. I know that you wanted to have some sort of individual task because running something like public goods game that specifically measures free riding prosocial versus kind of like individual game is difficult. But I would a little bit at least caution you, because I think dictator game is not necessarily capturing what you are trying to kind of like measure or label as the social, prosocial behavior. And personal take, I know that I'm sucking all the oxygen. The third one is a question about the methodology, especially when you run this at the village level. You said you have 12 basically people per village, but you give people these identifiers like their sex, age, beliefs, and so on and so forth. If they are paired with somebody, and I don't know this, but if they are paired with someone within their own village, isn't that make them identifiable? Okay, so that's all.
Okay, so I forgot your first comment. I'm sorry.
The first comment was about different types of gods. You know, the beliefs that gods. I
can't remember if we asked these questions about what we like, how people perceive the role of the Christian God. It's possible we have some, like whether or not they think that he's likely to punish. And I can't remember, we had that in a previous version of a survey, and I just can't remember if it made it into the current one. So I'll check that out, because that could be an interesting source of heterogeneity. You know, I guess sort of my reading of, in terms of like whether or not we're capturing prosocial behavior, I mean, we have 3 different experiments. So not just the dictator game, we also have the Choose-your-dictator game. So your willingness to want to interact with a particular type of person. And then the joy of destruction game, sort of where you're willing to either like actually go out of your way at a cost to harm someone, or go out of your way at a cost to help someone. So, I mean, maybe we can agree to disagree on the characterization of whether or not that measures prosocial behavior, but even to the extent that it captures some measure of altruism, I think of that as sort of your prosocial inclination towards a particular type of individual. And then finally, in response to your comment on the matching, like we never match people within villages. So, yeah.
Thank you very much. And then the next question, again, I'm going to ask a question that I have in mind, and then I'm going to link it to something that was asked in the chat. Did you experience any problems with comprehension of the games? Because we noticed that in a lot of developing countries where we run our experiments, it's always a problem to not just run the experiment, but also explain how it works and make sure that people correctly understand it. And on that note, there's a question from Shreya in the chat. Did you look at all on how education affects your results? Like, is there an effect of like, or in general, do educated people believe in witchcraft at different rates compared to their less educated peers?
This is also a really important point in terms of how to administer these types of experiments. So we spend, I mean, this is a one-on-one interaction with an enumerator who's been working with me since like 2015. So they understand what we're doing. And then they spend quite a lot of time explaining these games. So I think from our enumerator's perspective, it's a very costly like interaction, and that they really have to go very slowly through the experiments. We have a ton of examples, and then we have test questions. And so by the time people get to the experiment and when they're making their allocation choices, they've gone through, you know, the instructions, the examples, the test questions, and we're pretty confident that they're able to do the experiment. I don't think we formally looked at heterogeneity based on education levels or test question comprehension, but that's something we should do in a robustness check. And then I think related to the question on education, so people who have higher levels of education are less likely to have strong beliefs, but across the board, you know, from entirely uneducated to college educated and above people report believing in witchcraft. So it's sort of yes, there is an effect of having more education on like the strength of the beliefs, but really people have and hold these beliefs despite sort of high levels of education.
Thank you very much. And then I'm just looking through the questions. So there's a question about measuring in-group effects. Mm-hmm. Can you talk a little bit more about how you measured them?
Yeah, so I probably went over this really quickly, but as I was saying, we give them 7 pieces of information on the other player. So like their gender, their age group, whether or not they're part of the same ethnic group, education level, etc. Their strength of belief in the Christian God, their strength of traditional supernatural beliefs. And I didn't present it here, but we do an exercise where we ask if you share sort of the same identity on any one of those dimensions with the other player, does that affect how you treat them? So if I'm of the same gender as the other player, if I'm of the same age group, if I'm of the same ethnic group, is there any consistent effect in these sort of shared identities on behavior? And we don't find that that's the case. And then of course, we're always controlling for your own identity, all the player 1 characteristics and all the player 2 characteristics in our specifications. So in short, you know, I have other work looking at sort of in-group favoritism, but we don't really find that that's the case here.
Thank you. And then I guess we have time for the last question, and it makes sense to ask it. So what are the programmatic implications for, say, COVID-19, like vaccination, or in general, just like COVID effects, or like anything where there's collective action?
You know, I haven't really thought about the link between what we're studying here and COVID-19 vaccination efforts. I mean, there is, at least where I work, this prevailing sense that either COVID isn't real or COVID doesn't affect people like them. So I think there is, I'm sure, an uphill battle for, you know, governments and NGOs trying to make an effort to get people to be vaccinated. Like, people just don't believe that it's going to be an issue. And there's also mistrust of vaccinations. And I just don't have the data to say at this moment whether or not that's systematically related with these traditional supernatural beliefs. So it's definitely an interesting question to explore. Like in other work, we look at correlations between these types of beliefs and, you know, seeking out the medical sector. And it would be nice to know also how it's related to willingness to get vaccinated for COVID-19. And I just don't know.
Thank you very much. I think we're answered everything that was asked. It was really interesting, and yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much for the opportunity, and yeah, I really appreciate it for all the feedback and questions. So thank you.